You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Well, hello and welcome to a new episode of the Hayek Program podcast. Well, as you probably recall, as a listener of the podcast, Money and the Rule of Law, Generality and Predictability and Monetary Institutions came out last year in 2021. It was written by Peter Boettke, Alexander Salter, and Daniel Smith. And shortly after that, we had a book panel discussion of the book, and we received very positive feedback from that. Well, we're several months on now from both the release of the book and also from the book panel episode, and we thought now would be a good time to tackle some questions that have arisen in the interim since that release. And so Peter Boettke and Dan Smith have graciously agreed to join me today and answer some of those questions. And so without further ado, we will jump right into those. All right, our first question. Who are the most influential interest groups impacting monetary institutions, specifically for the United States, but can be for other countries as well? And this is submitted by Peter Haslett.
So when Alex, Dan, and I were sitting down to write the book, first of all, the book Money and the Rule of Law is very American-centric. It's very U.S.-centric. So it doesn't talk about central banks worldwide. There obviously are lessons about central banks worldwide, but let's just stay on the U.S. system. And we were, in many ways, very influenced by a common professor of all of us, Richard Wagner, and the work that Wagner did in the 1970s, applying public choice to the Austrian business cycle theory and the notion of boom, bust, and political business cycles. And so when you ask the question of, what are the interest groups that are impacted by monetary institutions, I would start by the idea that from a political business cycle point of view, the monetary institutions are impacting the political elites the most because they're determining basically their electoral success. And so we can take that as a hypothesis to then explore on that. But then there's other groups that are tied to those electoral success. For example, at one time when union membership was very large in the United States, the unions played a very big role in dictating electoral success, and therefore they would have an impact on why it is I would want to have monetary policy in one way rather than another way. And so you'd have to identify those kind of groups today. And so in this sense, it's very much, so Milton Friedman wrote a book called Monetary Mischief. But before that, he had written a book called The Tyranny of the Status Quo. And in The Tyranny of Status Quo, he tried to explain why it is that even when there's been a massive shift in public opinion, it's so difficult to change the structure of government in a way that would be towards a more rule of law based, more open economy, free market economy rather than government regulated economy. And he postulates that there's an iron triangle. And so there's this iron triangles of interest between the politicians, the permanent bureaucracy, and then the special interest groups. And that they align together to make sure, and this is a line from Wagner, that monetary policy is done in a way that benefits those who created the institutions for their favor and their interests. And I think that's, that isn't a specific answer, but it's a way we frame thinking about the issue. And then the last thing I would say about that is one way to think about what we're doing public policy-wise in general is we're sifting through various different institutional mechanisms to look and see about means-ends efficiency, to see whether or not the institution is coherent with respect to the goals it sets for itself. So that's the first test, because you could imagine an institutional solution that isn't coherent with respect to its ends, and then we should reject that institution. But what we're also doing is if it passes the first test, the means ends, we then subject to a vulnerability test. So is that institution vulnerable to the opportunistic behavior of any of the actors in the institutions to act strategically to benefit themselves at the expense of others? And when you get that, then that raises a whole other set of questions. So Dan and I, in earlier work that we did that gets fed into the book, talking about the evolution of monetary policy views and monetary theory views of Hayek, Buchanan, and Friedman. Milton Friedman has this great passage in Capitalism and Freedom where he basically argues that the central bank is going to be subject to these interest group manipulations. And as he says, sometimes maybe central banking is too important to be left to the central bankers. And that notion and thinking about that, I think permeates throughout our book, is thinking about what are those institutions that meet the means ends test, but then what are the institutions which also can survive against opportunistic behavior, serve as a check against it. And if we sort through that, which is why the rule of law becomes so important, is because that's one of the ways that you try to do that, have non-discriminatory politics, then maybe that gets us a central bank that's worthy of the task that it's trying to set up for itself. But Dan, you have a...
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is it really highlights the importance of the approach we bring, looking at kind of a historical case study of different pressures, because I think at any one point, the influence that a special interest group has changed according to the political context at that time. So sometimes you see it's the farmers or the home builders, sometimes it's Wall Street, other times it's Congress. So I think if you're just looking at any one type of influence, you tend to lose out on the overall picture and may not get the full extent of influence being exerted on central banking institutions over time. Really important, I think, is not to forget the special interest group of the Federal Reserve itself as employees at an entrenched bureaucratic institution that have there's not a lot of accountability, and when you're the major employer of monetary economists around the world, that does give you a lot of professional and policy sway over the direction of central banking.
All right, very good. Moving on to our second question. What are the best institutional constraints that can be put in place, whether on the Fed, Congress, or the executive branch, to get the Fed following rules-based monetary policy? Submitted by Thomas Savage.
Yeah, so I think this is a great question, and fundamentally this is the question that we want our book to inspire, because we focus most of this book on making the case for having rules, but we spend a little bit less time, and this may be a fault of the book, but actually we really wanted to focus just getting back to people asking this question, say, how can we actually constrain central banking institutions? We highlight three different mechanisms in the book. One of them is simply create some type of monetary rule like the Taylor rule or NGDP targeting, and make it has to be enforceable. So it has to have punishment mechanisms, possibly reward mechanisms. It can't just be a pseudo rule that central bankers have the discretion to say what the rule is and when we can deviate from the rule. No, it's got to be a really tightly binding rule. And it's really hard around the world when you look at central banks that have tried to impose some type of inflation targeting rule. You oftentimes see that there's either not a punishment mechanism or they actually change the targets over time. So there's a lot of discretion in the rules that have been applied thus far. I think one of the ones that, I won't speak on behalf of my co-authors, but one of my favorite types of rules would be NGDP targeting. I think it solves a lot of knowledge problems that central banks face. And it could also be very, you can explicitly write it and make it enforceable. The other two mechanisms that we discuss is one is constitutionalized money. So if money is to be seen as a property right of citizens rather than a prerogative of central bankers, why not put it in the Constitution alongside other fundamental rights that people, it's a fundamental basis of free society, one of the most important mechanisms for why capitalism outperforms other types of institutions like socialism. So put it there in the Constitution and protect it, at least relatively, from the discretion of politicians. Then the third one, which I find the most intriguing, but is also the politically least feasible, is free banking. And that would be, it sounds radical, but I think there's a lot of good research looking at historical episodes and exploring the theoretical possibility of this, allowing banks to actually issue competitive currency, even against central banks, as an alternative, as a disciplinary mechanism on the market. And there's automatic adjustment processes in the market that would ensure that if a bank was overissuing currency, people would redeem that currency. So it solves the knowledge and incentive problems that central banks face in trying to be a monopoly supplier of fiat currency. So yeah, we explore those three avenues. There could be more than that. But those are the three top ones. Of those three, my favorite is free banking. But like I said, I also think it's at least in the current political regime, unfeasible.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in one way we are trying to put the notion of rule-based policy back at the core and to disabuse people that the idea of basically constrained discretion can substitute for rule-based policy. So we're trying to knock out the legs from arguments to get us back to a position where we agree that monetary policy must fit like with all other fundamental policies. And then it may be the case, like Friedman, as Dan and I did in these other papers, and also with Alex, where we make the argument that you look at the evolution of these people's arguments, and they started, someone like Hayek is a monetary equilibrium theorist. The most consistent position for a central bank under a monetary equilibrium would be an NGDP targeting kind of position. And, Hayek kind of evolves to that position. At an earlier time, you might have said he was a gold standard guy. And, he takes different bites of an apple as he goes through his career. And he leaves the earlier position because he's frustrated with the ability to achieve it in the world. And we want to get back to that evolution because it might actually end up by being that the alternative that can actually achieve the kind of stability and predictability in money is actually a free banking system, which is so counterintuitive. But we don't explore that in detail. We point backwards to the work of our colleagues Larry White and George Selgin, but also forward to people that are going to write the next book, maybe Dan Smith and Alex Salter and others, and Will Luther and Tom Hogan and a bunch of other scholars that are trying to wrestle with this at the moment. And I think that that's how the book kind of ends. It sort of sets us back onto a conversation that has a future trajectory, which we don't go all the way through. But going back to Dan's answer to the first question, one of the things that should not be questioned is that the Federal Reserve has been captured and is under political pressure. So the idea that it's an independent central bank that hasn't been batted around with political pressure, we detail with very, documentary evidence the ways in which it has been subjected to political influence throughout its history. And, that is an important component to understanding how that institution is vulnerable to this opportunistic behavior. So it has to be fixed. And then we also spent a lot of time showing that they can't do what the market would do, which is one of the reasons why the nominal income, targeting goal is actually a better goal, is because in many ways it's relying on a market to generate that information rather than the government being able to try to set money supply equal to money demand. We're getting information all the time to adjust and adopt. And so we're dealing with those knowledge problems to try to find the right institution. So we have knowledge problems and we have the public choice problems. And what institutions would maybe fit those that is consistent with the rule of law, which is a meta argument about how the society should be organized. And that's it. But it may be the case that when we trace the trajectory out, that the core institution, which we leave as given, is the institution that must be challenged, which is central banking. So we do not challenge central banking in this book per se, right? We're working within a world where people say there's a central bank and how would you organize policy? Now, in the process, we're raising a bunch of questions about central banking's effectiveness that may push you on a trajectory which pushes you, again, like to White and Selgin's work on how would the invisible hand handle money. But we think in a forward way, building off of their work, at least that's a hope, I think, yeah.
Jim Covington asks our third question: how does the Hayekian triangle work? I've had confusion about it in the past and would love to see some clarification on what it is.
Okay, so I mean, in a very technical sense, or sort of basic definitional sense, let's start with that. The Hayekian triangle is just trying to explain the relationship between goods of a higher order and goods of a lower order in an economy. And what I mean by goods of the higher order and goods of the lower order is simply capital goods and consumer goods. And so one way to think about this is, in order for you to enjoy your bacon with your eggs in the morning, someone has to raise hogs on a farm, and they have to invest in hogs with an expectation of being able to sell bacon down the road. And if they couldn't sell the bacon, or tastes of bacon changed such that we don't have as much bacon, then all of a sudden that's going to affect the producer goods or capital goods that are invested in making hogs. And so the relationship between these producer goods and consumer goods is mediated through time. So it takes time to produce a hog that will produce bacon or produce a ham sandwich. And so how do I coordinate that activity through time? So let's move away from, a simple thing like a hog and bacon to things like, right now someone is working on an automobile that won't be used for another 10 years. But I'm paying engineers, I'm investing in, getting the materials and building the computer programs to help with the manufacturing of all that. All that is going on various stages of production in order to produce cars down the road. But if all of a sudden consumer demands shift because cars are desired less, then that's going to change what those investments were, the value of those investments. And remember, each one of those investments is a profit and loss calculation. And so the Hayekian triangle is showing what it would look like if it was perfectly coordinated, meaning that the intertemporal coordination process was mediated through interest rates, which are determined by the market, which reflect the savings and consumption trade-offs that people want to do, so that the investments match with the consumption that you're going on. So, right? Well, what happens when that gets distorted? So a large part of our book begins with the basic idea of the ubiquitousness of monetary calculation. So monetary calculation is core to the story of the book. And that's because money is one half of all exchanges. In a modern economy, goods trade for money and money purchase goods. Or, money purchases goods and then goods purchase money. What we never have is goods just producing good, trading for goods. We don't have a sophisticated barter economy. So that means money is one half of all exchanges in the economy. And if money is one half of all the exchanges in the economy, if you mess up the money, if you engage in what Milton Friedman called monetary mischief, that mischief has a lot more impact than just on prices changing. Right? It distorts the ability to engage in investment activity. Investment in production gets distorted, and we end up by producing things in the wrong place at the wrong time, using the wrong workers, and we have then booms and busts. And so we want to make sure that we handle monetary mischief precisely because the errors that are produced by that mischief have a deeper problem in the economy, the more we recognize the intricate complexity of the production schedule. And when economists don't pay attention to the time structure of production because for tractability reasons they treat capital different, then what that does is they don't miss the monetary mischief, they just miss the full difficulties that monetary mischief forces upon an economy. And so that's why the Hayekian approach to capital, which is capital is made up, the capital structure is made up of heterogeneous goods that have multiple specific uses. And that means that the economic calculation of the uses of those goods is so sensitive to these outcomes that if you make an error in that, it's not like you can just cautiously rearrange the capital. The capital is lumpy, and it causes time and difficulties and delays and everything like that. And so that creates waste. That waste leads to less gains from trade, less wealth creation in your society. and you end up by having, the bust phase. And so that's why we are working with that Hayekian triangle and trying to clarify that relationship between investment and production and the relative prices that coordinate that with consumption. So the production plans of some must mesh with the consumption demands of others. That is achieved through the relative prices in a market economy. Intertemporally, that price is the interest rate. The interest rate is can be manipulated by the monetary authority through their conscious decision. That creates monetary mischief. That leads to the misallocation of capital, therefore creating problems in your economy.
Yeah, so the only thing I would add to that is I think when, like we talk about prior to the financial crisis, that the Federal Reserve was engaging in too easy of a monetary policy. And so what that implies when it comes to the Hayekian triangle is that artificially low interest rates were causing people to consume more because the interest rate was low, so they could take out consumer loans, more automobile loans, buy more houses or bigger houses than they were expecting to. But on the investment side, interest rates are low, so they're also supplying less capital as well. So you get in this weird situation where resources are being pulled in different directions intertemporally, and that's unsustainable. And eventually it's going to, according to the Austrian theory, lead to a collapse. And then on the flip side, we argue after the financial crisis hit, the monetary policy got too tight, and then you get to the opposite problem occurring. So you go from one extreme to the other. And this is precisely during times of uncertainty when there's a recession like that. You want to allocate resources back to the underlying true value that consumers place on them where they should be. And this just creates, interjects uncertainty into the process when it's already a very uncertain environment for entrepreneurs to try to wade through.
Coming in with our fourth question is Jeff Tambier. He asks, do you believe that there will be a resurgence of interest in Austrian macroeconomics after the COVID recession?
So following up on what Dan was just talking about, this is a very interesting question because the book focuses a lot on the financial crisis because the financial crisis was a monetary-induced boom and bust cycle, we would contend. That was directed in a particular way because of real policies that steered investments towards housing markets and particular things, right? But it still nevertheless was a function of monetary policy that created this issue and then exacerbated it when they were trying to do the correction, okay? Now, COVID is a supply shock, which is a different kind of recession. So the COVID recession and the original recovery are not themselves an Austrian type cycle. It doesn't mean that Austrian cycle theory is wrong. It just means that it's not applicable to that particular moment in time because that was a supply shock and it's sort of like a real business cycle kind of story. But the shock did reveal some of the vulnerabilities of the policies that have been adopted since 2008. So I would argue, and I don't want to hold my co-authors to the same thing, but I would argue that, like, say, the zero lower bound kind of stuff and other kinds of monetary policies that we engaged in just simply meant that we were losing out on the number of bullets that we had that we could address this issue with monetary policy as opposed to addressing it with fiscal policy, which is why it is that it all went into the fiscal policy side. But then the reality is that, the old juggling trick of fiscal policy is you run deficits that accumulate into public debt and then you debase the currency, which then ends up by screwing up the monetary policy and you get monetary mischief. So, I kid around a lot. I started kidding around during the as Dan knows because he worked with me on some of these things, I started kidding around, in the 2008, 2009, 2010 period. I would walk around, I'd have a copy of Hayek's Tiger by the Tail and Buchanan and Wagner's Democracy and Deficits. And I'd say, look, I want to box the ears of, policymakers with these two books because we have the monetary legacy of Keynes, which is monetary mischief, and you have the fiscal legacy of Keynes, which is fiscal irresponsibility. You put the two of them together, and it's not a good recipe for the future of mankind or whatever, right? So now I mean, that's maybe overstating and hyperbole or whatever. Now, so what's fascinating, I think, is that what the COVID has done is it has forced us to pay attention to a variety of policy shocks. So you have supply side shocks, you have monetary shocks, you can have fiscal shocks, and understanding. So I think this gets us back to understanding Austrian macroeconomics. What do I mean by that? Too many people think Austrian macroeconomics should be viewed in a very kind of rote manner, right? That is, you start with a supply and demand curve for loanable funds. You move the interest rate artificially below the market rate. That leads to people biting off more investment projects than they can chew. The reality is as the money works its way through the system, as consumer preferences reassert itself, that means that they're going to have to continually bid up to get the resources for the investment. They prove to be a bust, and so we get this boom and bust cycle. Okay, for teaching principles of economics, the bite, chew, and choke kind of approach of Austrian business cycle is correct. But I think for sophisticated economists, this story is a little bit more nuanced, which is it's a set of components about how you approach a problem in macroeconomics. So keep in mind that there is no such thing as macroeconomics. There may be macroeconomic phenomena, but it can only be understood and addressed with microeconomics. So all economics in many ways is relative price economics. So we have to force to that. But what are the components? One, money is non-neutral. Like what I said earlier, money is one half of all exchanges. If you screw around with money, you're going to screw around with all exchanges, which is going to distort the relative price structure in the economy. Two, capital is made up of heterogeneous and multi-specific goods. That is that you can use steel to produce a variety of goods, but you can't really use steel to produce a backpack or your shoes or your pants that you're wearing, and these kind of things. And so capital has multiple uses, multiple specific uses, but it's not homogeneous. It can't be used for all uses. And that means that we have to be sensitive to the relative prices because they're going to guide us in the way that we engage in production activity. So money's non-neutral. Capital is made up of heterogeneous, multi-specific goods, and that production activity takes place through time. All right, so therefore we're going to put a premium on the interest rate and the way in which we engage in intertemporal coordination. And so really at the end of the day, economics is a coordination problem. And the way the coordination problem is solved, and remember that coordination problem is the production plans of some must mesh with the consumption demands of others. And the way that happens is through relative prices. So property, prices, and profit and loss. Property rights are going to incentivize us. Relative prices guide us. Profits lure us. Losses discipline us. And anytime we attenuate that process, we're going to have coordination problems. And so that's the basic Austrian cycle theory. The economics of coordination problem and this non-neutral money, heterogeneous and multi-specific capital goods, and that economic processes take place through time. Now, COVID. Dan wants to sell wine. He wants to open up a vineyard and sell wine, but he can't find anyone to work on his vineyard. So we'll call that a supply chain problem, right? Right? He can't get anyone to help him produce the wine. I would like to consume wine, but I can't get a job to consume the wine. But why can't I go work in Dan's farm, vineyard, and then be able to do that? Well, right now we're not being able to solve that coordination problem. We're talking on November 5th in the afternoon. I didn't get a chance to look at the jobs report today, but it was released earlier this morning. And they were expecting, at least in the pre-market expectations, that 450,000 new jobs would be added to the rolls, in the month of October. So I should check that to see if that's what happened. And but what's interesting is that we have the largest joblessness rate that we've ever had right now, and that's a coordination problem. What's going on with that? And so part of the book that Dan and Alex and I wrote is we're trying to forge an adult conversation in our profession about serious problems. So what is the end game strategy for the Fed after we gave the Fed extraordinary measures, right? That's one. What is going on with these, structural difficulties with unemployment? We're all public choice scholars. So we've spent a lot of time talking about a rent-seeking society and the rise of a rent-seeking society. Well, if we're living in a rent-seeking society, that creates all kinds of gumming up of labor markets, right? That create all the problems that a lot of people identify as thinking that's what capitalism does. But a lot of the mobility issues and other things like that are all because of rent-seeking and privileges that need to be eradicated. And we're trying to identify some of those things. So we're trying to have an adult conversation about the policies of the Fed. We're trying to have an adult conversation about the difficulties in labor markets that are caused by gumming up labor markets. And we don't do it in here, but again, pointing to it, we would want to have a conversation about promissory politics and fiscal responsibility and what the consequences of that are because of the interrelationship between fiscal and monetary policy and the pressures that are in the monetary policy and the fiscal policy. So if you're asking me, is Austrian business cycle theory going to explain post-COVID? I would say that's a little bit more difficult because it's not necessarily a monetary induced. But is macroeconomics from a price theoretic framework going to get a boost? And I would say, yeah, because that's the only way you can really have the right explanation for these supply chain issues that we're dealing with, what the consequences are when, Alex has been amazing at getting his point of view and slices of our point of view in very nice outlets. A lot of Wall Street Journal articles since the book's been published. And he had a very interesting one about, what's going on with quote unquote inflation, at the moment, because it is true that the Fed has been very loose in a lot of ways. And that goes back to the zero lower, bound and all that kind of stuff and whether or not they're going to, sort of try to correct that. But the reality is that these rising prices are a function of a supply constraint. And so there's a opening up of the economy means that you have more demand. The supply side hasn't been able to adjust this quickly for a variety of reasons. What's that going to do? It's going to put an upward pressure on prices in the economy. So how much of that is due to inflation versus just simply normal supply and demand reactions is very important for economists to sort out. And a lot of people that are influenced by Austrian economics jump too quickly to the idea that we're going to have hyperinflation because they look at the money supply and they don't look at the relationship between money supply and money demand. And so, this is what causes some of the problems there. My saying that might get me in trouble with some people that hear this or whatever. But I think macroeconomics from a price theoretic point of view is poised for a boom, right? But macroeconomics that just focuses on the monetary induced boom and bust cycle, that is consistent with a price theoretic macroeconomics, but it's not the only version of a price theoretic macroeconomics. And I think that's what we have to be careful of. Do you have any?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is I think COVID-19 and the Federal Reserve's response to it provides one of the best cases for why we need the rule of law applied to the Federal Reserve. Some of these policies that were implemented during COVID-19, such as direct lending to state and local governments and the moral hazard problems that causes, intervention in the bond market, which has no bank run problem, right? There's no liquidity problem there that the central bank needs to solve. And that could prevent, we were talking about coordination, reallocation of resources. Companies like Boeing that were doing bad prior to COVID-19 were trying to lobby for a bailout. This policy hit, it's bailed out the bond market. Now they don't need to get that bailout anymore. So one of the silver linings of a recession is that companies come out leaner and meaner on the other side, right? They either go under and reallocate resources to firms that are better, or they get new management, they make changes, they cut costs. With the policy implemented there in the bond market, we're not seeing a lot of that reallocation occurring. So we're coming out of this, I think, weaker than we would have without that policy. The central bank lent money to major financial institutions to buy equity, and that equity was held as collateral for those loans. So if those loans went bad, we would have the Federal Reserve holding U.S. stock. And that means they potentially could be voting on who was in charge of those companies. There were already Congresswoman Maxine Waters was already like agitating for, well, if we're going to be doing this, can we impose a $15 minimum wage through this capacity? Could we impose environmental policies? So there's a lot of ways that legislators could actually impose some policies on corporations through these facilities if the Federal Reserve finds itself bailing out bond markets and holding U.S. stock. And then, lending straight to Main Street businesses, direct allocation of credit rather just providing general liquidity, that puts the Federal Reserve in charge of picking winners and losers. I think these policies developed during COVID-19 represent a huge threat if used repeatedly every time there's a recession going forward, and there's no reason to think they won't be employed. And the legal monetary scholar Lev Menand has looked at the legality of these programs, and consistently he finds that they actually violate the explicit rule of law of the Federal Reserve. Yeah. So it's clear that we have a central bank that is operating outside of any legal restraint. And that is a great case for what we're for the point we're making in the book, that we desperately need to apply the rule of law that we appreciate in every other aspect of governance in a classical liberal society to apply to one of the most important institutions, central banking.
Yeah, I just to wrap that up, I think that is one of the really key things to stress, is that how by giving the Fed these extraordinary powers during this time, it actually deviates from its mission significantly. And so we turned the Fed into something that it was never designed to do, and that creates problems. And, the origins weren't just with COVID-19. I mean, these issues, what's going on in the bond market, that started, years ago with Bernanke's Operation Twist. So everyone remembers quantitative easing, but the Operation Twist was a crucial part that's in addition to quantitative easing. So when they keep on talking about, tapering, they keep on talking about quantitative easing, but the other tapering is getting the hell out of the Operation Twist kind of idea. And so Selgin, has been very good at writing about these kind of things for the last decade. He had a great paper called Operation Twist the Truth, to sort of laying all these things out. And, to some extent, our book is highlighting those and then showing how when we were shocked with COVID, the response was to expand the powers of the Fed even more than what they had earlier. And that hasn't been brought up yet. And so we're trying to really push that conversation. And I think that's one of the reasons why the book was received well by former Fed officials. So, our book gets some nice endorsements from good monetary economists, Leo Hanahan, John Taylor, Peter Ireland. But the other thing is that we had some former Fed presidents, the president of, I think, the Atlanta Fed, the president of the Cleveland Fed, and the reason is because when they look at these issues, they see a Federal Reserve which is different from what it is that they think and understood was the mandate of this institution. And so they want to say, hey, let's get back to our original mandate, because it's that mandate which is essential for monetary policy in a free society, not these extraordinary measures.
Question number 5 belongs to Frank Vogel. He asks, is the increase in relative prices always a consequence of inflation, according to the Austrians?
So this relates to just my capital, argument there. It is not everywhere. And so inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomena, but relative price changes are not always inflationary. And so we're not talking about changes in price levels. That's a mistake that some macroeconomists focus on. So when I say a price theoretic macroeconomics, I mean a relative price in economics that puts emphasis on the relative prices and the coordinating role that property prices and profit loss play in a system. That's why in the very, very beginning of our book, we talk about what economic calculation is. In the very beginning of Mises's Human Action, he talks about monetary calculation. Not monetary calculation about what socialism has a problem with, but how monetary calculation is how capitalism works, which is exactly what we're trying to do in our book as well. And so that requires the free exchange of goods and services to establish freely established exchange ratios, which are relative prices. But those relative prices are going up, they're going down, they're doing all kinds of things related to supply and demand conditions. And when we talk about inflation, those distortions happen because of factors other than supply and demand factors. And so that's why it takes, you have to sort through those things. And so not every time that we see an increase in price is it due to monetary inflation, but it could be. And so that's what requires research. Yeah. You have anything to...
I think it also highlights the knowledge problems that we review in the book when it comes to central banks trying to figure out how, what effect they're having on the economy. How do you measure inflation? Because one of the issues right now is if you're just looking at year-to-year inflation, well, prices collapsed a year ago. So it looks like prices have increased drastically, but really it's just a lot of that is just recovery to the prices, and then the supply side constraints as well that we're seeing. Yeah. But it shows the difficulty that, really good economists are arguing right now about whether we're seeing inflation, what the extent is. And then now the central bank has changed its operating framework to after the fact, we're going to respond to inflation once it manifests. Well, are we going to target, what's the time frame we're going to look at inflation over? How quickly are we going to get back to the target of 2% inflation? Over what time frame are you going to take to get back? I mean, there's knowledge problems embedded in trying to interpret what's going on in the economy. And that's why we make the case for rules, is that, maybe we're just not really good at this. And if we just had a predictable rule that required non-discriminatory policy, we'd be better off than we would in trying to examine these unknowns.
And finally, Jim Franz comes in with our final question. He asks, do you have any follow-up projects planned after Money and the Rule of Law?
I actually, in each individual of us have a ton of different projects going on. So you should look at the websites and see, and follow the working papers. But I would say that I think that a natural outgrowth of our project is either to push in that direction of alternative institutional arrangements other than a central bank. And so that's one kind of avenue. Or the other one would be to stay within the confines of the existing institutions in the United States and to pursue the issue of fiscal policy. So if we've taken on the issue of what would be rule-bound monetary policy, what would a predictable and stable fiscal policy look like that could do the job? And I think this is one of the key issues about Buchanan and why he was so important, was because unlike a lot of other free market economists who think public finance is little more than looking at the books of the mafia or something like that, Buchanan wanted us to look at the way which government's structured and institutions that are associated with spending and revenue decisions. So in Buchanan's idea, the linkage between the expenditure decision and the revenue decision has to be tightly linked. Otherwise, we engage in wrestling with the fiscal commons. And a large part of concentrating benefit, dispersed cost logic in politics divorces the revenue decision from the expenditure decision. And with that, you get the kind of intergenerational accounting that has produced such a massive problem in America, right? Which is that we have a gap before COVID of intergenerational accounting of something like a fiscal gap of something like $211 trillion. And since COVID, we've been spending, think again about, wherever you are in the political spectrum, the reality is that the infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better kind of bill government is going to be signing the largest spending bill in the history of mankind. Not in the history of the United States, the history of mankind that they are signing off on. It was big enough after the financial crisis when, they signed into act the TARP and everything else. It was $800 billion If you remember, that's oh my God, we're going to 800 billion, and then look at the numbers that they're doing. This one, and so wherever you are on the idea, you just have to stop for a second, think, oh wow, like those are real numbers, and they're making those kind of commitments. So I think the fiscal side of this equation is something that would also require a book length treatment like Money and the Rule of Law, and hopefully either us or someone else that is in our same kind of way of thinking is conceiving of doing that. But I can't recommend highly enough, the listeners going to Dan's webpage or to Alex's webpage to look at the work of themselves and their colleagues at their respective centers. And in particular, to look at Dan's most recent book with Eileen Norcross on public pensions, and to look at the work that Alex is doing with Andy Young having to do with what you could call microstates and the emergence of the rules and governance structures of these microstates coming out of the medieval period. So, and those are just slices of the research program that both of them are engaged in, but it's very, very exciting. And just, we're just really, I was just very, very fortunate to work with two really talented young economists.
And we enjoyed the experience as well. I mean, it was a smooth and rewarding experience. And this was during COVID-19. I had a child, and I think we still turned in the book several months early, if I remember correctly. So yeah, I don't think we have anything currently explicitly planned, but I think we'd be delighted to work together. We were a great team. I will say that I learned a lot about, so especially in business schools, books, I think are underappreciated among economists. And through this experience, we had written, co-authored maybe something like 10 journal articles that served as the basis for this over a decade. And I was amazed at how much I learned, the nuance that maybe I'd gotten wrong, things that I'd learned since we had written those articles, things that we learned tying them together, that, I realized just writing even several academic articles, I didn't fully grasp what I was working on. And taking the time to write the book actually disciplined me and made me more humble about the topic. And that was a really good experience that I definitely expect to continue with my future research is that model is write academic journal articles, but then try to follow up as a book.
I think that's a great insight, actually, because I think that, when you're writing a book, you're kind of forced to get to the essence of an argument, but yet also keep it tight. And you're trying to link it with other ones, and that requires you to do something more than you would do when you were doing the journal article, which is different. I also think we were very fortunate because the Mercatus Center was right before COVID hit. The Mercatus Center ran a manuscript conference for us, and we had some really good people at that manuscript conference to give us comments and discuss ideas with us. David Beckworth's one of them, who's a fantastic monetary economist, but also Dick Wagner was there and some other people, and Larry, and we got really good, comments. Will Luther was fantastic, Thomas Hogan. And so we absorbed a lot of information and tried to then process it during that. And then, again, Mercatus, we were able to have a research assistant, a very talented young scholar, Louis Renaud. I'm maybe saying his name not quite right, but, he's at Western Kentucky right now, and he was phenomenal. He went through line by line. He has a background in monetary economics. He really checked us and was great. And of course, working with you and Alex is just, phenomenal. You guys are, have matured as scholars. You're all, tenured full faculty members now building your program. It's been a while since you've been out of graduate school, and, watching you, become, these full-fledged, really, really serious economic thinkers is just a joy. And again, that's because I think I want to take credit somewhat for it because of Mercatus and what, our Mercatus programs fill out, both for while they're students here, but then also the opportunities that Mercatus continues to provide for alumni and other people after they get out of graduate school and whatnot. So I think we're, hopefully we're back to normal and doing these kind of things again. And with that will come more and more books. Though I will tell you from my experience is that when the little ones turn from 2 to 8, that becomes a different, household production function. And when they turn from 8 to 15, it becomes a real lot different production. And then you got to wait until they're like 20, and then life gets good again. So this is a time process of production too. And it's also really thrilling to see, you and Alex with your families and, all the different things. So again, I just am very, very thrilled to see how well your careers are, evolving and just great. So congratulations for that.
Thank you, Pete.
All right. Well, thank you, Pete, and thank you, Dan, for giving us some of your time today to answer these questions. And just a reminder to everybody, if you want to learn more about the book, you can always purchase it on Amazon and read it there. Or you can go into the archives of the Hayek Program podcast, and you can find our book panel discussion, which also features Alex Salter. He was the third co-author on this book. Thank you once again for listening in, everybody. We do appreciate the time that you give to the podcast, and we do ultimately hope that this is one more step on your journeys to becoming lifelong learners. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.